Okay, good morning, everybody. So good morning and welcome. My name is John Lettieri. I'm the co-founder and policy director of the Economic Innovation Group. On behalf of all of us at EIG, we want to welcome you this morning. Very glad you're here and proud to be a host of this important conversation. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to say a few words about who we are at EIG, why we care about this topic. EIG is a new organization. We were launched about 1 year ago with a unique mission to help policymakers create a more dynamic U.S. economy by empowering investors and entrepreneurs to get engaged. The timing of today's event is obviously significant. It comes in the midst of a campaign where we've seen candidates on both sides challenge the established political and economic order and tap into a growing resentment among voters and a lack of faith among voters in the American dream. So there's much we don't understand about the forces at work here. You could certainly say that the debates have produced more heat than light. Solutions may be in short supply. On one hand, you have a candidate who has promised an expansion of entitlements in the role of government that is unprecedented. And on the other hand, you have a frontrunner now who promises a literal fortress America, complete with its own wall, although the wall's height is negotiable. So there's a lot to be unpacked there. There's obviously vast differences in the platforms of Sanders and Trump, but the premise is very much the same. Washington has forgotten about you, and the economy is rigged. And so at EIG, we've attempted to understand what are the economic underpinnings that make that message so resonant with voters on both sides of the aisle. We've tried to shine more light on why Americans are losing faith in that American dream. And we begin with a simple premise that place matters. Research shows that someone's chances of achieving the American dream are incredibly dependent on one simple factor. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? What zip code? So when it comes to understanding the disconnect between the growth of the American economy, 6 years of national recovery, and the discontentment and anxiety that voters feel, before you can understand the why, first you have to understand the where. And to that end, EIG recently released a report analyzing what we call the Distressed Communities Index, a copy of which is in your folders here this morning. We hope you'll take a look. We found that more than 50 million Americans live in an economically distressed community. And millions more live in communities that have seen little or no meaningful job growth or business growth since the end of the recession. For example, nationwide we saw about 5.5% job growth coming out of the recession between 2010 and 2013. In prosperous zip codes, job growth was triple that, more than triple that. But in the median U.S. community, where fundamentals like educational attainment and the rate of adults working exceed the national average, job growth was only 2.3%, less than half the national rate. Incomes, too, were below the state average, and the median U.S. community saw a net zero business growth during those first 4 years of the recovery, zero. So when Donald Trump says we don't win anymore as a country, to many of us in Washington that sounds silly. But to many Americans that sounds like home. So now to tell us how we're going to fix all of this, I want to introduce our panelists this morning. First, our moderator, John Avlon. John is the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast. He's a CNN contributor and won the National Society of Newspaper Columnists Award for Best Online Column in 2012. He's also the author of several appropriately titled books, Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics, and my favorite, Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. Previously, he was a columnist and associate editor of the New York Sun and a speechwriter for New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Next, we have Janet Adamy. Janet is the news editor at the Wall Street Journal, Washington Bureau, where she writes about demographics and the economy. Janet was part of a team that won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, and she's led a video series on the Affordable Care Act that was nominated for an Emmy in 2014. Dr. Jared Bernstein is next. Jared is a senior fellow for the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Previously, you all know him as the chief economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, member of the president's economic team. We like to think of him as our co-chair of the Economic Advisory Board. That's what he means to us. The other co-chair is also here, Dr. Kevin Hassett. Kevin is the James Q. Wilson State Farm Chair of American Politics and Culture at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also an AEI resident scholar and their head of economic policy studies. Before joining AEI, Kevin was a senior economist at the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve System, and an associate professor of economics at Columbia Business School. He's advised a number of Republican presidential candidates, beginning with John McCain's campaign in the year 2000. And last but not least, we have Amy Walter. Amy is the national editor of the Cook Political Report, where she provides analysis of the issues, trends, and events that shape our country's political system. Amy is the former political director of ABC News and is also an exclusive panelist on NBC's Meet the Press and a regular panelist on Washington Week with Gwen Ifill and Special Report with Brett Baer. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
So we just go sit in the chair.
Okay.
All right. Well, happy day after
People who made it.
Super
good for you.
Tuesday.
Yeah.
Must all have cars.
Well, we'll hopefully, with this great panel, add a little more depth to the dynamics in the election, and then, maybe even discuss governing a little bit, that thing that this is all preamble to. But I think what's fascinating about EIG's data, to me, is it helps put a lot of meat on the bones on one of the most perplexing and unique things about this election, which is a time of great populist anger during an economic recovery. Those two things aren't supposed to go together. Traditionally, they haven't. And when you start seeing in this data the unequal distribution of the recovery, all of a sudden it starts becoming a lot more comprehensible. What are the roots of a lot of this anger right now? So Amy, I think it would be political malpractice not to begin with you, to sort of overlay the election results we've seen, including last night, with this economic data and how these pockets of deep disparity are fueling anger and driving candidacies, whether they be Bernie Sanders and populism on the left or Donald Trump and conservative populism on the right.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent, first, hello, congratulations for making it. Good luck getting home. So that's all I have to say about that. If I were you, I'd leave as soon as this is over and get back.
But not before.
Oh yeah, not before, but wait till it's over and then go back home. What I find it really interesting as somebody who is supposed to be prognosticating about elections, and I started this election, as many of us did, with many grand theories about how this race was going to look going forward. One of the biggest things we talked about at the very beginning was the role that immigration was going to play. And Donald Trump, of course, set that stage, talking about walls and humanely rounding up 11 million people. And we thought that was going to be the driver for much of this debate. Obviously, Marco Rubio in a tight spot because of his support for comprehensive immigration reform. And yet, when you look at the exit polling, the issue of immigration among Republicans comes in second or third, and in some cases a far behind third to the economy and to jobs and to the size of government. And it really gets to the heart of your point, which is that for voters, the issue of immigration is not separate from the issue of the economy. The feeling that our jobs are going overseas, people are coming in and taking our jobs, the feeling of sort of despair and anxiety that is about more than just building a wall. And I think where Trump has succeeded, and this has been something that nobody can quite figure out how to get him off of this, or to take him off balance, but the balancing act he's been able to perform is he's convinced a group downscale, especially lower income, blue-collar Americans who have been very distressed and detached from the process. He's convinced them to engage in a way that no Republican candidate has been able to do, and certainly since I've been covering this. And so he's been able to bring out a new segment of the Republican electorate. He understood who they were and has been able to get them out. At the same time, while he doesn't do as well among the sort of white-collar, managerial, sort of business elites, he does well enough with them so that he's not simply the populist angry candidate. He's not simply the Bernie Sanders, I'm there with my pitchfork, arguing for the little guy. When I talk to the sort of downscale voters, what they believe is that he's going to stick by what he says, and he is going to be a hardliner and committed to all those taking on China, crushing the wall, all those issues he's going to stick with. And yet when you talk to the more elite business types who say they're supporting Trump. Some of them tell me that quietly. They don't say it all that publicly. They say he's a great deal maker. That's what he's going to do. He's going to make deals. He doesn't believe any of that stuff. He's not going to get us in a trade war with China. He's just going to be tough with China. He's going to tell Japan to back off, right? So you have a group of his voters who believe he's totally flexible and a group that believes he's an absolute hardliner, and he's been able to keep both of them happy until this point.
Yeah.
Now, how long is the real issue?
Well, it's totally insane too, because the transcendent character value to him also is allegedly authenticity.
Right. And it's good.
You know, so
Yeah.
those two things are deep cross purposes.
Yep.
Janet, you know, one of the things that's also interesting about this data is the demographics. We think about our country politically. We've been conditioned since at least 2000 to think about red states and blue states. But one of the things this data shows is the deeper divides maybe are rural or urban. And while there are regional pockets in the South, particularly cornerstone of the Republican Party right now, have a disproportionate number of distressed areas. There are other deep red state areas like the Mountain West, which are doing pretty well economically, doing beautifully. So how do you understand the demographic overlay on this and how that fuels a lot of populist anger? The white versus black of it, the urban versus rural of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to go back to when you're really looking at demographics, what the big story is what the GOP missed in trying to prepare for this election. So when the GOP did its autopsy, and everyone called it the autopsy in 2012, you know, why did we do so badly? The takeaway was we are a party that does not reflect where the country is going. The country is becoming more diverse, more Latinos and other minorities. You have a young millennial generation coming up, and we need to have candidates, you know, across the board that appeal to those kind of voters, and that's why you saw, you know, the ascendance of Marco Rubio. I mean, he was basically a candidate who was kind of designed to appeal to a changing country. And as we saw last night, you know, we have been surprised. I mean, and this wasn't just, you know, the GOP. When you talk to demographers who really dug into this data, they said, you know, there's really no hope for the Republican Party to continue winning or to regain its stride if it doesn't broaden its appeal. And yet, I think we've all been surprised at the extent to which basically, you know, white male voters, particularly those with lower levels of education, really have become a dominant force in this election. I mean, what the polling that we've done, it shows that, you know, we've all heard that the Trump supporters they're less educated whites, and they tend to have not rebounded since the last recession. 62% lack a college degree, more than 80% think immigration hurts the U.S., and 55% think that free trade is bad for the country, which is just, it's a stunning thing. I mean, the Republicans as supporters of free trade, all of a sudden you have all these Republicans who have kind of gotten on the anti-free trade bandwagon. So I think the demographic story here is just how much the Republican Party misread what was going to motivate the electorate this year.
So that's a perfect segue to Kevin, which is that, you know, you're a center-right economist, and all the things that seem to be policy, you know, pillars of the conservative movement received wisdom. They were from free trade to fixation on lower taxes. I mean, those are all being actively called into question by a front-running candidate who seems to have no particular interest in policy, let alone policy orthodoxy. So how are you confronting the gap between the conservative movement, the conservative populism right now, and the policies you've been advancing and your party's been advancing for decades?
You know,
you personally, I'm putting you on the hook for this, man.
You know, I'm an economist, so I whatever the party's doing, if it's correlated with what's correct, then I'll help them, and if it's not, then I won't. And so I don't want to speak to like what the party's historically done, because I think that sort of they come and go. But I can say that I'm working closely with President Obama's economic team to help them trade, you know, pass free trade right this year,
So
you know,
not a Trump supporter.
Well, I'm not sure, I don't view it as a partisan issue that way. That if you go back and look at the most progress we made in free trade, probably in my lifetime, was under Bill Clinton, where he, you know, found a coalition with the Republicans to get stuff passed. Right now, there are 28 votes for TPP in the House that are Democrats, and the rest are Republicans. And President Obama's trying to get it to happen. I think that free trade has been historically something that it's, you know, that there are concentrated losers and a lot of winners. You know, everybody who gets cheaper stuff. And that's a political difficult lift, right? Because the concentrated losers are organized so on. But I think that the truth of the story this time is a little more complicated, or at least like there's a theory of the story about the trade part of it this time. And that is that just as China entered the WTO and started sending lots of goods to the U.S., then people who are making goods in the U.S., naturally, this is what trade does, is that if you're not a person with a comparative advantage at something, then you do less of it. So people lost their jobs, say, making refrigerators or televisions. And we started getting those from China. Well, in an economic model, what happens is that those people then move to making non-tradable things. They're working in the service sector. And just as they were doing that, this is, again, the theory of what's going on, there's a wave of illegal immigration where you drive down the wages in the service sector. And so that the people are sort of getting a double whammy. Well, there's a problem in the sense that since the Great Depression, legal and illegal immigration declined, right? Because we weren't such an attractive place to go when the unemployment rate was so high. But I think that this background story for when China entered the WTO onward, relative, you have to balance demand and supply. That there's something to it. I'm not saying it's the only story, but if you don't have a wave of high-skilled immigrants, because H-1Bs are capped at a really low level, and you do have a wave of low-skilled immigrants, then you would expect to see that high-skilled wages continue to go up, but low-skilled wages don't.
Right.
And so the patterns in the data are consistent with this, and they also could explain the sort of confluence of the people who feel like the economy has screwed them and the people who are opposed to immigration, especially hostile to illegal immigration.
Certainly the data shows that industrial cities, particularly in the South and the Rust Belt, which did very well in the late 19th, early 20th century, have gotten washed out, and we trade being part of that. But I'm just going to press you, because beyond the headline, AEI economist endorses Hillary over Trump, which is basically what you just said.
That's not true. In fact, she has backed away, quite despicably from Bill's record. I mean, Bill's record is intellectually sound.
I don't disagree with you, but what I want to press you on is...
So you endorse Trump? That's right.
No. The Daily Beast has definitely not endorsed Donald Trump. But what I want to press you on is if a policy plank of a party like free trade has been a cornerstone of conservative and Republican policies for decades, and it has been soundly repudiated by the front runner, not tangentially, but explicitly. So how do you account for that in terms of the policies
I mean, that makes complete sense,
about?
but it's something that goes back. So I've done 5 presidential campaigns,
Correct.
and I'm not involved this time. And it looks like a good choice in retrospect. But every candidate has this problem. You go to town hall meetings and people say the Chinese are stealing our jobs. I lost my job, our factory closed, and here you are saying we should have free trade. You jerk. I mean, I've heard that. Pretty much every presidential candidate has to face that. And I think that the correct answer is that, and Austin Goolsbee actually said it well. I kind of got in trouble for it, right? But the real thing is that if you're going to have free trade, then what you should do is you should have a bill that is a paragraph that says we got free trade. But instead they have these bills that are thousands of pages. I'm just quoting Austin. And if you have a bill that's thousands of pages, it's because you're trading this against that, and you're making concessions. And so the question is, do we think that the trade bills that we passed that have been thousands of pages, that we've negotiated those well? And that's the hole in which the Trump is going, where he could sort of circle back.
So you're on the deal-making, non-absolute.
No, but there is deal-making in free trade. There's lots of it. That's why it's thousands of pages. And so to deny that would be incorrect.
Okay.
But I would rather say, let's have free trade and let's make it that the bill has to be a page. That's what I would prefer.
That's what makes it even more fascinating, is not only do you have a candidate repudiating the centerpiece of the Republican mantra on free trade, but he has actively exploited the very things that he now is saying are terrible, right? So he's creating his products overseas for the very reason that free trade works for many people in corporate America. And yet he's also convinced people that he's going to be the better negotiator on trade.
Hashtag nothing matters. Jared, let's talk about the populism on the rise on the left right now. I mean, you have worked with Vice President Biden. You are I think left of center economist within the context of the Democratic Party in the last 2 decades. How do you explain, and did you see coming, the kind of left-wing populism that Bernie Sanders represents, not simply left of Bill Clinton, but a democratic socialist leading a populist revival in the Democratic Party that has given Hillary Clinton until last night a real run for her money. And what does that say about the deeper divides in the Democratic Party?
I don't think it's that surprising. I think a very good question is what took it so long, both on the Democrat and the Republican side, this kind of populism. Let me speak to two factors that I think are notable. I take it a lot of people here have seen The Big Short, the movie The Big Short. There seems to have heads nodding.
If you haven't, you should. It's brilliant.
Great movie. There's this dynamic, I call it the Big Short sigh. It happened in the viewing that I went to, but I'll bet it happens in all the viewings, where at the end of The Big Short, the narrator says, and then all the guys who made this happen went to jail. And then he says, just kidding. And everybody in the theater goes, ugh. And in fact, he goes on to say, a lot of these financial innovators are back to doing what they were doing before after they've been bailed out. And I think that, so that's one fact. The other fact, set of facts I put in your pamphlet here, and it just shows 3 slides of wage trends that are at the heart of what we're talking about. One shows
Consult your binders, everybody.
One show on the upper left-hand corner, you see the change in real hourly wages from 27 to 2015. So this is recent vintage data, just came out through 2015. And you see that basically for the bottom 60%, you've got nothing, stagnant or declining wages. By the way, the 10th percentile is doing a little better than the rest. That has to do with higher minimum wages. You see the blue-collar manufacturing wage, that actually doubled, these are all real dollars, doubled between the 40s and the 70s. It went from $10 to $20 an hour, and it hasn't changed since then. Okay, this is not new stuff. Then, and this is numbers that we just, some colleagues of mine at the Center on Budget just tricked out for me. Then you look at the earnings of white, non-Hispanic males, 25 to 54, with less than a college degree. So these are white guys. They don't have a college degree and they're prime age. And this looks at the distribution. So at the bottom you have the 10th percentile. That is 90% earn more, 10% earn less. And it goes from 10,000 to 0. Now how can it go to 0? They're not in the job market anymore. So that's 10% of these guys. They're not even in the job market anymore. Then you look at the mean, which is one of those lines there. I'm colorblind, so it doesn't help me. But one of these lines is the mean. And it goes down about 8%. The median goes down 20%. You can stop looking at this. The bloodbath on the wage side is clear. This is not new. This is not something that just happened when Donald Trump stumbled on the scene. It's been going on for a long time. You couple that with the bailout dynamics, the Big Short sigh that I described, the fact that a bunch of people who blew up the economy, who didn't go to jail, but instead got bailed out and recovered way before the rest of us. You couple that with that, and then you add in this thing that you and Kevin were just having an interchange on, the idea that the prescriptions of not just the Republican, this gets to your Democrat question, but of both parties, the prescriptions of both parties have demonstrably failed a non-trivial group of workers. So you can say all you want about, quote, free trade. I don't think there is any free trade. Again, I agree with Kevin. If it's free, it doesn't take 30 chapters. That doesn't mean I oppose trade deals. I actually think you need rules of the road. But the problem is that none of the solutions proffered have altered these trends, as you can see right in front of you. I mean, this is not complicated stuff. And there's your explanation.
Which I appreciate the comprehensiveness, but let me push you on one point. You're in the White House in the immediate aftermath of the bailout and the Great Recession recovery. How much did you guys focus on or even actively discuss either more aggressive punitive action against the bad actors or elements and policies that could actually help address this long-term stagnation for middle-class and working-class workers?
Well,
you had Congress in the first 2 years at least.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it was, it's a great question, it's an absolutely fair question. So two answers to that I remember very well, because at some level that responsibility was entrusted on myself and the vice president, right? We had the middle-class task force and so on.
Right.
First of all, you definitely need to worry about inequality and wage stagnation, but if you're in the midst of a nightmarish recession that could morph to depression, you've got to worry about that first. So without growth is necessary but not sufficient. GDP growth, necessary but not sufficient to deal with these problems, but it sure as hell isn't necessary. So we just had to, pull the fire alarm and try to do whatever we could to get the macroeconomy back on track. That meant bailing out certain actors in our view, and that was an unfortunate reality. There was not and on the second part of your question, there was just not nearly enough progressive energy to do a lot of the sorts of things that I think would have made a kind of a difference. Let me give you one example, unions. Okay, unions actually played a significant role in helping President Obama get elected, and President Obama very much believed that we should have a level playing field for union organization. But when we tried to move the Employee Free Choice Act, for example, a very important set of legislation to help boost collective bargaining, which would be part of a solution to this, I found out that, in fact, Republicans hate unions more than Democrats like them. And it sort of was the end of the game there. So basically, there was no really progressive base upon which to build some of these ideas that would have made a difference. And that, again, gets to your first question. The reason why you've got the Bernie populism on the left and the Trump on the right is because no one has offered a set of solutions that resonate with folks beset by these trends.
Okay. So Amy, as we get to the practical politics of this general election, one of the things the data from EIG shows is that a lot of the southern cities are particularly hurting, and you've got fascinating disparities in states like Texas, right, which have a superficial economic miracle, but massive disparity even within a city like San Antonio, and which I'll get to former Mayor Castro in a second, but not this question. The real battleground won't be in those southern cities. The real battleground will be in the Rust Belt, and Donald Trump has trumpeted his support among a lot of the white working class voters in the Rust Belt, and we'll have more tests of that coming up. But that's a place where Democrats can credibly win. They have in the past. Hillary Clinton did particularly well among many of those workers in 2008. So how do you see this economic frustration bubbling up in a general election when it comes to people trying to win, the Pennsylvania, Ohio, the Rust Belt cities and states that are going to be necessary to cobble together a majority?
Right. Well, there are two things going on, at least when I see it and speak with voters. Some of them in those blue industrial states, some in just a traditional swing states like Colorado and others. What I've been hearing, especially, we sit down with this group called the Walmart Moms, that a group that has come together now, group of moms, shop at Walmart, been bringing them together since 2008. A Democrat and Republican pollster conduct these focus groups. And it's been fascinating because we've been following them since the 2009. And what you saw after 2009 was exactly that, the very real despair of, oh my God, are we gonna make it? Like, I don't know that we're gonna get food on the table kind of despair. Where we are now is the frustration, not just about the wage piece, but the cost of living as well, which goes to the trade argument, which is always about, well, you get in a trade war with China, things cost more, you're not gonna be able to go to Walmart and get stuff. What they're saying is, it's already expensive for me to go to Walmart. I'm already not keeping up, even as I'm getting more security in my job. The next piece is about the demographics, and I think this is a really important thing to remember. What the 2012 autopsy showed was that the bottom line is that we are a changing country. It does not look like 1980. And when I hear this argument that Donald Trump is sort of the new Ronald Reagan who's gonna go and bring these disaffected Democrats from Midwestern states like Ronald Reagan did with Macomb County, Michigan, and in Rust Belt America and bring them over, you just have to look at what the demographics were in 1980, okay? White working class Americans, white male working class Americans are a smaller share of the electorate. They will be 30% of the electorate. This is not a growing piece. Ronald Reagan won in 1980, carrying 56% of the white vote. He swept the country, won by 10 points. Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote and lost. There are not enough downscale white voters.
A question so that's a great point that I meant to make also, and I've been thinking about that. How come this relatively small group of people
gets so much attention?
And is so influential?
And you know why? It's because we like to cover them because they are understandable. And let's face it, most people covering politics are also white.
Well, I think
Okay?
the other thing is
and,
that
and that is a big, so it's an easy
So
story.
this is all your fault.
it is, but the other thing is that
I've been trying to write the other story.
they vote in high numbers. So you're talking about these older.
No.
Well, when you
look
compare
at-
them to like the young Latino
when you
population, that
compare
gets so much
exactly.
attention. I mean,
but when you compare white working class voters to white college voters, white working class voters 57% turnout, white college 77%. You're right, Latino only at 50%, but blacks turned out at 60%. So white working class Americans, it's true, if you just bumped their numbers to 77% in line with where white college educated voters are, you flip the electoral college. Absolutely, Republicans sweep and win. But that's assuming that you don't bump them at Latino, which this will be, I think, you're exactly right, a big test for Democrats about getting those voters registered and engaged. And it's assuming that Republicans with this message that is a Donald Trump message on cultural, social, and other issues doesn't turn off the white college, which I think he absolutely will. And so you lose white college voters at the expense of bumping up white non-college voters.
Although that hasn't happened yet within the primary electorate, but it's a different cohort when you
Exactly.
get to a general. So, but Janet, let's dig a little bit deeper down on some of the swing voters in the swing states who are feeling economic despair, and the fact that a lot of the optimism or pessimism doesn't seem to be equally distributed when you look at, for example, white workers and black workers. That you actually have more optimism on the part of a lot of black workers, maybe for partisan political reasons, whereas it's a lot of the white working class that feels really despairing about long-term prospects, even though African-American workers may actually have it objectively worse.
I think I want to get back to what Jared was saying. I mean, the disconnect is, so we have all heard that wages have been just not growing at a very high level. But what's troubling people is they see headlines and they hear all this news about how the economy is getting better, the stock market is going up, home values are rebounding, and yet because the wage piece has been so lagging, I think that's where a lot of this frustration comes from. You were talking about the demographically. I mean, basically you have the pockets where there is the most softness in the economy continue to be the Rust Belt states, and I think that's what the motivation is. I also wanted to get back to something that Jared was saying about why didn't Democrats do more to improve the economy. I think we forget about this time, the first 2 years that the White House, that we had this Democratic-controlled Congress, and Obama spent most of that political capital on passing a health care bill.
Absolutely.
And the health care bill, the original argument that he made with that was that was going to help people in the pocketbook, that if we lowered people's premiums, people were spending, he originally promised that we were going to save, the average American family would save $2,500 a month if the Affordable Care Act passed. He kind of gradually backed away from that, and then what we ended up seeing was that the Affordable Care Act decreased people's premiums, but these plans came with these out-of-pocket costs. So I think one thing you have to think about is, yes, the White House really did try to do something to help the average American who was struggling with costs across the board, but the Affordable Care Act came with these kind of hidden costs that I think continue to weigh on people.
Would it have been better to just have said, let's just do infrastructure spending and just had we gone back in time and you could say, let's not do healthcare, let's just put stimulus, like just put $1 jillion more into different.
I mean, there was definitely infrastructure and stimulus, by the way. It was
Not a lot.
But even
not a lot.
more.
No, not a lot.
That was notable.
And the stimulus didn't last long enough, given the depth of the downturn. I think that was $2,500 a year. I think, not a month, but
Sorry, $2,500 a year, yes.
That makes more sense.
so.
That'd be awesome. If
But you've got
$2,500.
a great point. Your point is extremely well taken, and we definitely spent, as I mentioned, you got to get out of recession before you worry about micro kind of dynamics or wage trends, and of course they're related. But then you're right, a lot of political capital on what I think is a great advance for the nation. But that's a different seminar or debate. But the question I was answering is, could we have done more to boost wages? And there I would say it's actually very hard. I mean, of course we didn't have Congress, we tried on the minimum wage, they're still trying on the minimum wage, but it's actually very hard to pass policies that raise the middle class or median wage. And while I think there is an agenda to do that, but it does mean investing in infrastructure. It does mean extending the earned income tax credit perhaps higher up the scale. It means actually the Federal Reserve has to balance things a little differently in terms of of emphasizing full employment. And that is an agenda that we really, I would argue, haven't seen.
So Kevin, let's talk about what could be a Republican agenda to address some of these pockets. And let's assume, I think fairly, even though you're not advising any presidential nominees this cycle, that there's a political argument for doing so as well if you want to win some of these swing states, particularly in the Rust Belt. It seems to me that addressing income inequality is a matter of long-term societal stability, and to the extent that conservatives value societal stability, there should be a prescription, a policy prescription to help address it. Does one exist that I'm simply too dim to be aware of? And what can and should Republicans be doing in this election to not get blown out in these pockets of inequality, particularly in Rust Belt states?
Yeah. Again, I'll leave the political calculus to the people who are expert at it, but I could think about what's correct. And I think that if any party adopts policies that are correct, it'll be good for everybody. And the correct answer is not complicated. And it's very inconsistent with the kind of stuff that Jerry's been pushing and that the left has been pushing. And it just goes back to, like, suppose you yourself want your consumption to go up 5 years from now. You're thinking ahead, and you think, I want growth, I want consumption growth. Then how do you do that? What are your strategies for lifting your own consumption? There are two things. You can invest in human capital, you can make yourself better, and then drive your wage up. Or you can acquire capital yourself. So suppose that you don't go to restaurants this year, put the money in the bank. And then there was a time when interest rates were positive. Remember that?
Yeah, I don't. Actually, I don't remember that.
But yeah, well, I'm older than you, I guess. But then you have money in the bank, and then 5 years from now, if you've been doing that for a while, it compounds.
Right.
And then you take the money out of the bank, and you use that to finance your consumption in the future. And so if you try to consume more because you borrow on your Visa card, then that's not going to be a sustainable increase in your consumption because you're going to have to pay it back, and where's the money come from? So ultimately, you've got to have more human capital, more physical capital. Those are the two ways, the strategies you can do it. The same is true for a country. So if we want our country to support higher consumption for everybody 5 years from now, higher wages for everybody 5 years from now, we have to have higher human capital, which you probably don't want to do if you want to, you're not going to accomplish that if you sort of follow the teacher union strategy of what we do to education in the U.S. And you have to have more capital. You have to be more friendly to the people that Bernie Sanders is attacking. And so I want to make one last point. And this goes back to the work that Jared and I have been collegially in a nonpartisan way, because we don't think it's a partisan issue, doing with EIG. That I think the interesting thing about the Distressed Communities Index and why it's such a great opportunity is that it's not a political thing, and it makes you think about it this way. And so if you think about Camden, let's think about Camden. It's the most distressed community in our report is Camden. That if you think about Camden, New Jersey, what are we going to do to help Camden? So you could say, well, let's have a repatriation holiday so the capital comes home. But if you want to address real misery in this country, then what you have to do is you have to make sure that some of that money goes to Camden, right? It's got to go to Camden. So how are we going to help Camden? And the answer is not to tax the rich people in Camden more. The answer is not to lift the minimum wage in Camden. The answer is to lure capital to Camden so that there's a chance that people can sustain higher productivity and higher wages.
Okay.
And so that's what the strategy for any person who wants to fix our economy needs to be. But last point. So why are people running to Bernie Sanders and Trump, less so to Sanders now? The reason is that nobody's talking to them. So when are you risk-loving in politics as opposed to risk-averse? When you think you're screwed. When you want to take a chance because no one's talking to your problems, no one's addressing the problems that are making you look ahead and say, I'm screwed. And so if you're screwed, then you want to increase risk because it's your only hope. And so I think there are a lot of people, we see it in the Distressed Community Index, that feel like they're screwed, that their lives are not going to get better unless they take a big risk.
So that makes a lot of sense in helping explain the underlying populist sort of anger. But let me just press you on the Camden point, because the larger sort of macroeconomic example you gave doesn't necessarily address how you deal with specific pockets within a free market context. So put a little bit more meat on that bones in terms of policy,
right, and
especially if you don't want to be. And you indicated sort of a version of economic empowerment zones that would allow for specific investment. But let's drill down and pretend that politicians were actually interested in policy for a second.
Yeah, which as an aside, I gave a paper at a University of Chicago conference about a year ago where I looked at, there's all this new macroeconomic literature that finds negative effects of policy uncertainty. and really big negative effects. So when markets think that either this guy or this guy's got to get elected and they have wildly different policies, then it's really bad for risk spreads and things like that. And we found that the policy uncertainty tends to spike in a presidential election year, which makes sense because there are people with, okay,
Sure.
This year policy uncertainty has gone down. It's incredible. Right, so while all this stuff has been going on, it's like the markets think, well, these guys are talking a lot, but they're not going to do anything. Policy, it's the first time I've ever seen anything like it. So during a presidential election cycle, policy uncertainty has gone down.
Fascinating.
Right.
And
So
disturbing.
anyway, so I think that the answer is, and I'm going to say it the way I say it. Jared and I left in our paper a lot of sort of vague language because we haven't completely nailed down like an agreement about how to do this. But I asked everybody in this room, so you want to help the pockets that seem hopeless right now, and you aren't helping them, right? Like maybe you are, but most people aren't making an effort. Why not? And the answer is you don't know how. You don't know how. You don't know what to do. You could give money to a charity that works there, and I'm sure many of us do. But you don't have great hope that you're making a difference, and you want to make a difference. And so I think that the key insight of the approach that I think we believe in, certainly from the satellite view, is that we need to find a way to help people make a difference. And our view is that we don't want to leave it to like some central planned strategy to turn Camden around. We don't think that that's going to work. But if we did do something like make a investment vehicle where, let me just like fast forward to the thought so that we don't spend all day explaining it. Suppose that somebody like the Carlyle Group had $100 billion and they had to invest it in Camden. Then what would happen next? That you could imagine all sorts of things would have to happen. That they would try to negotiate with the local government to make sure that there was rule of law. That they would do. But if you go to H Street and you see, if you look at the successful places,
what's the mechanism by which you're recommending that the Carlyle Group would have to invest?
Well, what we want to
$100
do
million in
is,
Camden?
or what I want to do, I'll say just this for me, but it follows from the distressed community work that we've been doing, is I want to make it so that, like you've got, maybe a lot of people in this room have a Vanguard account, and you've got all these different funds in your Vanguard account, and you can, sometimes you move it around, but if you do, you pay capital gains tax, right?
Right.
And what I would like to do is create something that I guess we're calling a domestic emerging market fund, where they have to invest in distressed communities. You can make a difference because you can put your money in this fund. That fund really, ex ante, should make money because these distressed communities are starving for capital. So if we put capital in, it should have a high marginal product. And then we need to come up, agree to tax incentives so that people really don't have a large cost for moving the money in. So what I would do is, I've had money in the S&P 500 since I graduated college. This is now a long time ago. I'd like to be able to take that money and put it in the distressed community fund and not have to pay a capital gains tax while I do it. It's not like I'm taking it out and eating it. I just want to put it to work in Camden. And so some kind of policy like that, I think, could throw a massive flood of capital into distressed communities, and then we're actually solving the problem about how your consumption goes higher. We're putting capital in those places.
I like it. I like
Thanks.
it. That was a good explanation, and I appreciate it, and I hope people are listening who are on presidential campaigns. But somehow I
maybe
think
hope not.
Well, look, I appreciate the bipartisan spirit in which a lot of this is being done and should be done. But Amy and Janet, and we'll start with Amy. Part of the problem we've seen over the last administration is that previously bipartisan policies like a public-private infrastructure bank no longer have bipartisan support. And why do you think that is, and why should we think it will be different in the next president, whether it's Trump, Cruz, Hillary, or Bernie? Or Kasich? Keep up alive.
Yeah. Okay. Some of this is really goes to the heart of the changes that I've seen since I started covering Congress, which was when I started covering Congress in the late 90s, and I met pretty much every single candidate that ran for Congress, the good, the not so good, the winners, the losers. And it was a very parochial process, right? You came in, my favorite story was meeting with David Wu, who's then was elected to be the congressman from Portland, Oregon, and this guy Ronnie Shouse, who was the last Democrat elected in Jackson, Mississippi. And I literally met them back to back. And David Wu came in, and he's representing everything that we've been talking about communities that are excelling, right? He represents Nike and Intel. He was a software attorney. He was all about the internet and Pacific trade and looking that way. Okay, Democrat, that was his message and how he was going to help the community in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. Ronnie Schaus comes in. He was a Democrat commissioner of the roads in Mississippi, okay? Infrastructure. And all he said during that interview, when I asked him what he wanted to come to Washington to do, he said, 4-lane highways. It's all about getting my people from rural Mississippi to Jackson for jobs, okay? But that's what they wanted to do, and that's what they thought. They both could figure out a way to do that. Now, when I sit down and I meet with candidates, it's not parochial, it's not about what my community wants, it's a national sort of litmus test about these broad ideologies. And so the idea of looking out for your community, yes, they want to look out for their community, but mostly they're looking out for their ideology. And so we've lost that piece of it. And it makes it harder then to do the deals, right? Because if I'm Ronnie Schaus and I say, I just want money to build roads, okay, we can create, there are probably a whole bunch of other people who want money to build roads, and we also have the people who want to do the trade. Ronnie Schaus probably wasn't going to be big on trade, but he could count on David Wu helping him in another place, and he helps David Wu somewhere else. So I think we've lost that. There is no moderate center to the party anymore, to either party, which makes it impossible to cut the deals, and there's no consequence for behavior that says that.
Do you think either party, or an asymmetric polarization, at least for the moment, is still a fact?
Listen, I think it's still that it is harder for a Republican moderate, but at the same time, ask yourself, this is the other challenge for voters, and I appreciate their frustration and their anger that things aren't getting done, and so their answer to that, and the only answer they have is to vote people out who are in power and to say, I'm going to send a message. The problem with each of these elections we've had since 2006, these wave elections, is guess who loses in wave elections? Moderates. Compromisers, deal makers. We lost all the moderate Republicans in 2006. We lost all the moderate Democrats in 2010. And now what we're left with is on either side.
Division and dysfunction.
Yeah, and I think the reason they lose is because when they do compromise, their opponent can then take that compromise and run a nasty ad of, this candidate joined with, this Republican joined with this Democrat is, going along with them, or to the extent that any Republicans in Congress over the last 7 years even got close to Obama, you saw negative ads saying, so-and-so is cozying up to Obama. I think that candidates now in both parties, I think it's pretty equal in both parties, they just see a whole basket of negative downside to working with the other side because it could come back to haunt them, and not a lot of upside. And I think Marco Rubio is a great example of that. So Marco Rubio, son of Cuban immigrants, felt, you get the sense that Rubio truly felt like immigration in this country is broken and that he really wanted to fix it, right? So he became part of this Gang of Eight, was working with Democrats on this, was taking some positions that were more liberal, and it just totally came back to haunt him, right? And also, he got nothing done. So the idea of, it's almost like just kind of stepping across the line could basically give you a black mark against you that you may never recover from. And I think that's why you're not seeing a lot of bridging between the two sides. I do want to make one point just about the...
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure,
so
go ahead.
were you two guys...
Let her finish her point.
Oh, okay, because if it was a different point,
Go
it was
ahead.
on that point. Were you guys surprised that Kevin Brady survived? That because he seems like a very reasonable guy.
Well, here's the
He's
interesting
chairman of the
thing. We
Ways and
have
Means
not
Committee.
yet
He had
seen, and I'm somewhat surprised about it, but we've yet to see any upsets in the primaries that have taken place, even in states where Bernie Sanders did really well or where Donald Trump did very well, that incumbents have been able to survive and that insurgents have been unable to promote it. So I think so much of the attention right now has been on the top of the ticket that we're not seeing it trickle down. And that is sort of a fascinating argument. In some ways, it's because I think all the oxygen is just on those candidates. And if you're somebody else, the only way, and you're not a presidential candidate, if you're a congressional candidate, the only way you could get attention is to affiliate with Trump or to affiliate with Sanders, and you haven't seen that.
The point I just wanted to make is, so we're not all doom and gloom here. I mean, there are some areas of bipartisan agreement. I think what you saw between President Obama and Paul Ryan, their discussions about the earned income tax credit, that they both, coming from two totally different places on helping the poor, see some common ground in trying to expand the earned income tax credit. I think there's some hope. There are these little pockets where there could be some agreement.
Right. Well, and Jared, I mean, Paul Ryan couldn't be more different than Donald Trump, right? I mean, and he's someone who actually has talked about Republican approaches to helping the poor and is sort of a Kemp acolyte. And I love how Jack Kemp, is now sort of the prophet of the Republican Party, who was widely ignored in his lifetime outside 1996. But what hope do you have, to Janet's point, given your experience in the White House, that that it can get better with the new president? Let's say there's a Democratic president and Republicans control the House. That seems eminently probable. Why should we have hope, given your experience, that maybe something can get done on these
Yeah, I
issues?
don't think we should. Not a lot of hope.
Just to be clear, that was said
yeah.
with a smile, but it was despairing.
Yeah, but
A despairing smile.
except for the fact that I do sort of take some solace in the idea that people say, "Oh, Donald Trump." It's perfectly possible that Donald Trump could be the next president, and he probably won't be able to do much, which I take to be a good
Well, if
thing.
Donald Trump wins, the Republicans presumably keep the Senate and the House. So, presumably we don't have divided government if
Well, I mean, Paul.
Republicans
But the thing that he could do is apparently presidents are able to kind of start wars now, and prosecute them without Congress, which isn't the way it was when I grew up. So that is scary. So let me make a number of comments about some threads that have come up. So first of all, Ryan and Trump have a similarity that's actually disconcerting to me, because I agree with you that they're very different. Paul Ryan strikes me as much more responsible. But if you actually look at their budgets, Trump's fiscal plan is Ryan's on, I was going to say on steroids, but they're actually not. It's sort of pumped up. It's not even that different. Ryan proposes, and in fact, interestingly, you can see this in a Republican budget resolution that's now being introduced, and they propose massive tax cuts, and then there are these magic asterisks that somehow explain how you're going to cover the cuts in revenues. I think it's absolutely clear that if you were able to get any of that through, and I don't think you will in a divided Congress, because hopefully there'll still be enough Democrats to block that sort of thing, you'd have a much, much, much bigger fiscal problem than we have already. I wrote a piece the other day that showed that if Trump were able to implement his fiscal plan, that outside of some of the big ticket items that sort of go on automatic, he'd have to cut government spending by 114%. So that wouldn't happen. That's in the Post if you want to find it. Now, getting to, in many ways, to what feels like a more important kind of policy point to me is the discussion that we were sort of trying to have about what we could actually do to deal with some of the problems that we face if we were going to take them seriously. And here I definitely like the idea that Kevin and I came up with, and I very much endorse it. And I think you've got to sort of try all of the above. Much of the place-based investment ideas have been kind of a bust as we go through in our paper, but we think that this one has some potential. The problem is, and here I disagree with Kevin, that if you were to go to Camden, if Hillary Clinton were to go to Camden and say, I've got a great idea for you folks, it's going to have to do with a capital gains deferral that's going to help maybe people with 401ks or the Carlyle Group invest in your city, people would be like, laugh you out of town in a New York minute, because that's not addressing the immediate pain. And it might work, that's why I like it, but it might not. It's quite indirect. I happen to think it would be helpful, but you'll also have to recognize that the one thing, and here Kevin and I think disagree pretty fundamentally on a basic economic problem. The one thing that the American economy doesn't face right now is expensive capital, hasn't faced it for a long time, and won't face it probably for a long time going forward. What's blocking investment is not the cost of capital. That's cheap and plentiful. What's blocking investment is investors don't seem to be able to find a return on their investment that's better than they can get by screwing around with innovations in financial markets. And that's a real problem. Now, maybe our idea would help in that regard. Certainly, as Kevin and I agree, these are areas that are investment deserts and need a lot of work. But I think you need something much more direct. A responsible increase in the minimum wage would be a great selling point. It would actually help people, and it is helping people. We mentioned the earned income tax credit. That's probably something we agree on. But on the manufacturing side, places like Camden and Trenton and Baltimore and Detroit used to have, obviously, a lot more manufacturing going for them. then, and I don't think this is a free trade argument. I wrote a piece in the Times earlier this week that said it's really not about FTAs, free trade agreements. It's really about the way expanded trade has worked really quite poorly for these communities. Not for the nation as a whole, not for the Walmart shopper, but for communities. And the evidence of this is if you look at the fact that we have had large, persistent trade imbalances, trade deficits, since the mid-1970s, averaging 2.5%, -3% of GDP. This is a huge drag on growth. These communities know that it's hurt them. It's amazing to me that it's taken this long to find its way into the debate, but I'm glad it has. And if the answer from Republicans like my friend Kevin is more free trade agreements, I'm telling you, it's not going to work. What we need to have is an argument about how we can revitalize manufacturing in these communities. That doesn't mean bringing back jobs that were lost, because they're lost and they're not coming back. But I believe there's more we could do, and that's where, and actually I must say Hillary Clinton has a pretty articulated agenda on this. We can go into the weeds if you want, but that's to me where we need to take this.
Well, I mean, look, sort of what's being proposed, I guess, is essentially a carried interest loophole for investment in distressed communities. I mean, making the finances more attractive by manipulating the code through legislation, presumably, and that's interesting. But without going down a rabbit hole, are you saying that NAFTA, with 25 years hindsight as a Democrat in the White House, didn't work?
No, I'm not saying
or
that.
are you saying that its benefits have been badly
communicated? No, I'm not. I'm saying neither of the above. I'm saying that the free trade agreements are a big distraction, are a source of fractious, divisive debate that simply doesn't advance the goals of America in any recognizable way.
That seems fairly broadly negative.
It's not saying that no, as I said, we need rules of the road when we trade. I actually think there's some good stuff in the TPP. I think there's some, I don't think there's anything wrong with, I think there's a lot right with rules of the road when you trade with I'm saying that the free trade negotiation process is deeply broken, it's deeply untrusted. The country, the electorate thinks, many in the electorate, other than the elite establishment, thinks it's a corrupt process, and frankly, they're right. And so we need to move forward on expanded trade without getting sucked into these FTA battles that are fruitless and divisive.
Okay. I want to give you guys a chance to sum up before we go to questions, which is always where the most interesting things happen. But before then, I need to ask just a rank political question to Amy. So one of the things that jumped out to me in this report was San Antonio, which had one of the wealthiest, and Texas itself is sort of fascinating. It has 5 of the top 10 wealthiest zip codes, but it is actually has the most unequal zip codes as well. So great disparity under that sort of Texas success story, but particularly in San Antonio, which on 2 sides of town had one of the wealthiest zip codes and one of the poorest. Now, not for nothing, but the Obama administration's HUD secretary used to preside over that city, and that is somebody who is often talked about in shorthand as a leading contender to be Hillary Clinton's VP. So I guess the question is, to what extent does he need to own that problem, and to what extent is the administration, in your understanding, trying to do about that problem, with inequality in individual cities, and what are the politics of that moving forward? Because it's everybody's sort of shorthand. It may be lazy, but it's relevant, so let's discuss it.
The really interesting thing to me in watching this debate between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on many of these issues that have been brought about economic inequality and the battle for the working class, is how it has broken down along racial lines. And that what we're really talking about when we're talking about Bernie Sanders' appeal is his appeal among, especially white men, and his appeal among, in some cases, working class Americans. But even so, he still does very well with the sort of liberal elite who live on the other side of San Antonio, but appreciate that they live on the wealthy side and appreciate what's happening on the not wealthy side. What you're not seeing is that African Americans or women or others are feeling it or attracted to it in the same way.
Right.
All that is to say is that our demographics are also not perfectly lined up with our economics, and that they are, what many voters are doing is looking through the lens in which is comfortable for them and the person that they think can solve that the most. So if you're looking among Latino voters or among African American voters on who they believe is going to be able to help them, even a message of Bernie Sanders is not the thing that they're necessarily attracted to, or women necessarily believe that that's the right answer. So, ultimately, I do think this has been the challenge, and where Trump becomes a challenge for Hillary Clinton. He has a big demographic problem, but he has a very strong message, which when he's in his moments of lucidity, which happen occasionally. I think we saw it whenever that first real press conference he had, maybe it was after the first Super Tuesday, when he said, basically, okay, Hillary Clinton, you own this economy, you want to go and be the leader of this economy, and yet your entire debate has been about how shitty the economy still is. Sorry that we're online.
Everyone here is offended.
Sorry, everybody. So answer for that, Hillary Clinton. Have an answer for that, which she doesn't. So to your broader question about how do
Or highly specific
Democrats,
question
or
about
specific question about like how do
Clinton Castro
you
ticket, yeah.
The Clinton-Castro ticket.
Given this data.
Given this, I think it's less about this data than it is about the kinds. I think her challenge going forward is going to be about motivating and turning out the African American and Latino and female voters, much more so than focusing on just what's happening with the kind of Bernie Sanders white male problem. However, then you say, well, who motivates them? I don't know that Castro, kind of an unknown candidate from Texas, is the sort of person to do that. I think that
The motivation will be negative.
That an Elizabeth Warren is the kind of voter I think who could, or the kind of candidate that could be much more motivational. I think Sherrod Brown is also really much more attractive potential VP than Castro, just in his ability both to speak to white working class from his perch in Ohio and his background, but also you can see him doing well in motivating Cleveland and the communities there that need to turn out.
All right.
I would say, we talk, I think a point that we've missed here is to the extent that these problems are local and regional, Washington may not be the place for solutions to that. These are problems that governors should be addressing, that mayors should be addressing. So I think it will be interesting to see if people make that connection in this election, that, to the extent that I have there's a more specific economic situation in my town, maybe I need to look to my local representative, and then maybe that's where I'm gonna, take out some of my anger. I think, Amy mentioned something about women. I want to make one point about women. It's been so interesting how the split we've seen for Hillary Clinton among women, this idea that we have a chance. What could really be the distinguishing thing about this election in the end is that we could have our first female president in the United States, and yet you've seen this split among the supporters for Hillary Clinton. Older women going for her in disproportionate numbers, but a lot of hesitation among younger women who do not seem to be getting behind her. And I think one place where she could connect, if she can hit her stride in this regard, is getting an economic message out to women. The labor participation rate for women peaked in 1999, and it has been sort of plateauing and going down ever since then. I think women across all kinds of economic spectrums, lower and higher as well, look at the challenges to being in the workforce and raising kids, and they see a system that does not work for them. When I've talked to the Clinton campaign about this, they say that this is the thing that Hillary Clinton actually really gets excited about. She these are the kind of changes she actually wants to make. So I think if she can start connecting with voters along those lines, you could see a huge group of voters mobilize behind her.
That's a good point.
Kevin, just on concluding comments, as you look at the data in distressed communities, do you have confidence that there are enough Republicans in Congress who care about these issues, that they'll want to get engaged and offer solutions even if the presidential candidates don't?
Oh, sure. And the one thing about the presidential candidates, it's a policy thing that's a link to this question as well, is that if you think ahead, so policy uncertainty's gone down. That means that really you could almost say that there's not a lot of policy on the table right now. As you move towards a general, then people actually sometimes take seriously the idea that I've got to have an agenda that I'm going to legislate the first year. Very often the person who runs on an agenda then pursues it in the first year, and that's when big changes happen. But right now you can't really see things that people are serious about. Like the Trump tax plan was kind of the Bush plan times 1.5 or something. So I think then if you sort of think ahead to the sort of challenges and opportunity, let's just say, for the case of argument, that it's Trump and Clinton. Suppose that the Sanders voters the people who don't like Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party. Suppose that Trump wanted to target them. How would he do that? I'm not sure.
Well,
But suppose that Hillary wanted to target the Republicans that didn't like Trump. How would she do that? Well, then you could think of a million things, right? And so I would say that
tell me please what some of those million things are.
well, like the thing that we're just talking about, right? So we need to lure capital to distressed communities. We need to have a lower corporate rate, something President Obama has said. The kind of stuff that right now against Bernie Sanders you can't possibly say. But if she adopted President Obama's position on corporate tax policy, for example, that would be way to the middle of where she is.
Got it.
And so anyway, so I think looking ahead, I could see that Clinton might decide. She could decide not, but she might decide to try to steal the 20% of Republicans who say they're never going to vote for Trump.
Well,
I don't know how many it is, but it's probably, I'm guessing.
That would be
Yep,
that would
that's
be
probably right.
rational. I guess Jared, it also assumes that Trump voters are being motivated in part by policy, which I'm not sure there's evidence of. But let me just ask you, closing out here.
Sure.
How concerned are you, and Amy hinted to this, that Trump could sort of reset for the general by announcing a major works program and get to Hillary's left on a lot of issues, and that posing a real problem?
That's an interesting question. One of his main weapons is unpredictability. I think that obviously if that happened, she would definitely try to hit him for lurching, and you can't believe anything this guy says. I have no idea how. I'll leave it to our politicos to figure out how that would play out. It is true, and it's actually one of the things I like about Hillary Clinton relative to Bernie Sanders is that she is very much an incrementalist. And I think that is kind of realistic. And if you do get anything done in this country, it's probably going to be through increments, not through leapfrogging. That isn't to say that I have a lot of respect and admiration for what Bernie's brought to the table and his aspirations. I just have it's never been clear to me the path. However, even his aspirations have helped move things in a progressive direction that I like very much. Getting to Kevin's point a little bit just on this is that it seems, first, I happen to like President Obama's business tax plan, which does lower the corporate rate and broaden the base. I think it makes a lot of sense. It seems completely it would be completely out of character, and I think out of kind of at least received political wisdom on the Democratic side, that you could get anywhere in a general election by proposing any sort of thing that was perceived as a supply-side tax cut. That would just look terrible, even if you thought it was a good idea. So I think the politics of that are extremely challenging. And I think the extent to which Hillary Clinton grabs voters that are not now available to her, it's not through Republicans who are going to be attracted by a high-end tax cut. It's through working class people of all races and genders who need to see a path towards higher pay, who need to see a path towards higher bargaining power, who need to see a path toward more manufacturing, who need to see something alternative to free trade agreements, who need to see ways in which they might reconnect their living standards to the economy's growth.
Okay. On that note, let's open up to questions, because that's always the fun part. Yes, sir.
Despite the differences we've heard left and right, my imagination is that if the two of you,
Oh, there's a microphone for you.
okay, if Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Hassel were put in a room and given 24 hours to come up with a master plan by which everybody wins, everybody in the country, and if you agreed within 24 hours,
The
It
metro
ha-
would be open.
that you could do it, that you would each find a plan by which you could accomplish enough,
That's probably true.
and I'm sure that all of us in this room would say it's brilliant. I would suggest the odds of this American political system acting on that system, on that plan,
Low.
are approximately zero.
Yeah.
Assuming we have divided government. And the reason I say that is because if you look at however this election is won, it's going to be by ginning up opposition to the other side. It's not by selling complex policy ideas. The reason I'm posing it this way is I'm suggesting the American political system is broken a lot worse than you're painting. That even if were a plan by which everybody wins, and if the two of you agreed and then brought other economists on board, there'd be no upside to the two parties to agree, because the question is who gets credit, and every election is about who gets credit.
So let me start by responding to that. Look, I mean, we are in a deeply feverish place, and you may be right, but at some point the fever breaks. If you look at Barack Obama's most recent budget, if you listen to Hillary Clinton, you hear a set of ideas that I think are somewhere within the corral that you just drew. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, Kevin just said he liked something, I think you said you liked Barack Obama's business tax plan. And so there are a lot of those ideas right now, but the political fever is such that, as you correctly point out, they have no traction. At some point, that fever breaks. We've got to be ready for that point. I mean, what Kevin and I and other people like us do, and there's tons of people like that in this town, is we plan for that moment. Now, you could argue that we should all just go to sleep until the fever breaks, and that might not be a bad idea. Just watch Netflix for the next 5 years and wait for us to actually for facts to matter again. But all I know how to do is what I just
5
explained.
years? 5 years is what you think it'll take? Oh God.
You think it'll take longer?
Oh, I mean, just that parenthetical aside, I thought was relevant. Okay.
Can I just add that a lot of us know a lot of politicians in town, and I know President Obama a little bit. I know a lot of Republicans, and just virtually everybody I know. I actually think that they devote their lives to service because they love their country.
Yep.
They think that the ideas of the other guy will hurt the country.
Yep.
But they love the country, and that.
So why didn't we see more Republican support for the corporate tax plan of the president if you just?
No, I don't.
Good
I don't
point.
think the corporate. So I actually the president liked the camp plan. It was the real question is why
Was
didn't the camp
Repub-
plan?
and why didn't
you know,
the Republicans
killed
didn't like the
I mean,
camp plan?
Republicans killed the camp.
Yes, that's the issue.
My point is though that the hope for, and maybe it's excessively optimistic, but we have some successes we could go through over time for people like me and Jared, is that if you make a really convincing case that this will help the country, then you can move people because that's what they ultimately want to do. They want to win, but they want to help the
This
country. They're
gentleman
not
is
bad.
more-
Mostly, there are some bad people.
This
but they're
gentleman is
mostly not bad people.
more, I think this gentleman is more right than that. And I think the problem is, Kevin, with the way you laid it out, is that we literally have a system where 40 people who may or may not love America can stop everything in its tracks. And that's actually a unique problem with our democracy relative to
Well,
others.
it's relatively new. Amy, Jen, you want to add anything to that? Nope. All right, another question. Yes, sir. And then you.
Thank you all. This is really helpful, and thanks to Economic Innovation Group. The DCI is a great service. I'm Jimmy Kemp, and I run the Jack Kemp Foundation. And the American dream in distress is a reality. It's what my father focused his career on, that if you don't have capital and opportunity in the lowest income areas of the nation, then you don't have the American dream. So as Jesse Jackson loved to say, capitalism without capital is nothing but an ism. So talking about Camden, I think, is obviously incredibly important as an example of the places in distress. So, Jared, as you were talking about the direct impact that can be had versus the indirect impact, I take that to be the problem with the complexity of the tax code that we're dealing with and our inability to get comprehensive tax reform, let alone the corporate tax fix, which is so obvious, and there are 40 conservatives who are blocking it. So in lieu of those types of big plays, how do you get Camden? How do you do something effective? And I think it's kind of a lead-in to the concept of enterprise zones, which my father was a supporter of and advocated for. And on that, I just want to note, enterprise zones have never truly been tried. They were bastardized
In what way, yeah?
and turned into empowerment zones, which are tax credits. And so the comment that I'd like to make and have you all respond to is that true enterprise zones, zeroing out the capital gains tax, it may not be as direct as you would like, but government can't have necessarily a direct impact. It can't fix all the problems.
So Jimmy, let me suggest one idea, because I first of all, I miss your dad. We may not have agreed on everything, but his spirit is exactly where we need to be right now, and I hear it in your question as well. An idea of really striving for things that can work in bipartisan is kind of a cliche, but in a way that just makes sense, and that's fraught with compromise.
I like transpartisan, get through partisanship to solutions.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit like transsexual, which
know
kind of
it
takes you
does.
to a place you don't want to go. But anyway, look, the only thing I'll say about that is I've been really interested lately in this idea called job saturation. I think that there's no more direct way to create jobs than direct job creation. Now, you've mentioned that the government can't do that or something like that. Back in the Recovery Act, we had a deal where we subsidized private sector wages to the tune of 80 or 90%, but only for like 6 months. And this thing worked really well. It was called the TANF Emergency Jobs Fund. It was part of the Recovery Act. It worked really well. And by the way, Haley Barbour, Republican, loved it, said it worked great in Mississippi. And so I would say that while we definitely should apply the investment path that Kevin and I agree on, and you as well, we should also try something more direct, which is directly subsidizing employment, saturating these areas with jobs because they're job deserts. We don't have time to go into the details, but I'm happy to talk with you offline about that.
Janet, Amy?
If I could raise just another point that I think hasn't been made, which is a really important one, is I think we need to look at the way we're preparing workers in Camden and other places in the country for jobs. And there is a huge student loan debt crisis in this country. I think one of the pieces of this is taking a look at how we prepare people for jobs. We have been moving toward a more knowledge-based economy, and yet at the same time, the idea that the best thing for you to do is clearly to go to college and get as much college as you can, and that will make you as best prepared as possible. We're seeing that that's backfiring for a lot of young people. They're going to college, they're getting buried in debt, and then they're not finishing. And so then you have this huge gap where people can't get out from underneath their student loans, and yet they also don't have the kind of degree that gets them the sort of job that they were hoping to get. So I think that's one piece that really needs to be addressed in all this.
Well, I think that's a great point, and it also speaks to the real fundamental issue, which is people aren't just frustrated that government doesn't work, they don't think anything works, whether it's the big short sigh or whether it's that the educational system is broken. There is not one institution that I can think of that Americans feel fondly about. And so how do you then solve any of these problems if nobody trusts that the underlying values are going to work for them, right? That, okay, yeah, let's create this empowerment zone, then we're going to find out that somebody got really rich off of it, and somebody got then they put a little piece of whatever in the bill, and then they got some sort of benefit on it. I'm sure that's going to happen, then we get screwed and we get stuck with the bill. And so that's really where we are, and I don't want to be this apocalyptic, but there are times when I think the only way for the fever to break is that we have to hit an absolute ultimate crisis. And I think sometimes we think too fondly about the era of post-World War II America. Everybody worked together and we solved problems, things were lovely and wonderful. But that was a unique period in time. That isn't a traditional American period of time. And the only reason I think we worked so well together is that we shared one thing in common, which was going through an incredible tragedy of Great Depression and a world war. And I'm not saying I'm advocating that we go into a Great Depression and a world war, but I honestly don't know what else there can be in order
Trump may
to
be
do
helpful
that.
in this
I mean,
regard.
honestly, it's more than just fever breaking. It's that there is nothing that connects us as a country together. We are becoming more polarized and isolated in our communities, in our Facebook feeds, in our politics than ever, and there is less and less that unites us, even though theoretically we know that the idea of America unites us. But what the idea of America is to so many people now looks so different, and I just don't know any other way to believe that this changes.
Well, the other thing that was different is that the parties were ideologically diverse, which means you could create coalitions and governments. But, and I think it's fair to say that your dad is now being recognized as I think the political prophet he was, and hopefully I think his ideas will continue to live on and drive national agendas. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Evan Hoffman with the Organization for International Investment. This discussion has been really fascinating. Thank you. I'm curious, in all your work, we're talking about distressed communities, prosperous communities. Is there an example of a community that made the transition from one that was struggling to one that is prospering now? And can you talk about that example and maybe some best practices that other communities can adopt or look towards?
We were just talking about this, so building the index is a massive data project, and really what you want to do is have the index over time. so that you could look at how it, so we also started with the idea, I remember we got, before we even started making the index, we got unemployment at a very micro level and then looked at pockets where unemployment rates were really high for a long time. And then but that was easy to do if you had only one variable. Now we've got a much more granular measure that I think is really quite effective, but we haven't yet identified whether anyone has escaped successfully and what they did, and it's one of the main objectives of the next round of research. And so I can't right now tell you, but I know DC really well. And in part, so I've been very, very active. If anyone wants to go to urbanbaseball.org. I started a foundation a long time ago to start to rebuild youth sports in underprivileged parts of DC. Spent a lot of time in Anacostia, Ward 7, Ward 8, and watched some places succeed within the district. And it's happened a lot in the last 10, 15 years that the district has had pockets of rapid recovery, H Street being one of the more recent ones. And thinking about, there's an article in the Washingtonian about an old baseball friend of mine named Joe Englert, which I encourage you guys to go read. But Joe has been sort of at the forefront of reviving neighborhoods, and he's got a specific strategy that we could go into that's worked in DC. But one of the things that I've been noodling about lately in terms of Jared and I and our proposal is that one of the problems that you have, and you see this in Flint, is that you have really dysfunctional, non-responsive governments. And so, if you're going to lure capital to a place, are they really going to go to the place where the governments are so terrible that it's? And one of the reasons I think that DC has been able to recover is that we kind of the federal government kind of got in front of the dysfunctional city government a little bit, right? And it created an environment where you could actually start to revive neighborhoods, in part because DC government stopped being so stupid. And so exactly how to move forward with that thought is something that I've been noodling over. But I think that what we're going to find is that there aren't a lot of places that have been as successful as DC, and that there are very few places of distress that have recovered yet, which is why we have to get in there.
Yeah, please.
Quickly, Pittsburgh is a canonical example. Pittsburgh is a city that was really destined for the Rust Belt, and it saw meds and eds coming, and it was very much a public-private endeavor. So the answer to your question very briefly is when you're one of these places whose portfolio is very narrow, even if you're a North Dakota and you're making a fortune out of fracking, and who knew that oil was going to go to $30 a barrel, that's where, and by the way, Venezuela's in the same situation right now. It's really tough. It's always about broadening the portfolio and having the foresight to see which industries are coming and making those events. It's not rocket science.
Janet?
Yeah, I think another place, I'll pick my hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan. So you hear about all the doom and gloom on the east side of the state. Grand Rapids is actually doing extremely well. It was historically a furniture manufacturing hub. All of those they've lost so many furniture manufacturing jobs, a lot of office furniture manufacturing, but they had little pockets of different things they did, and it was across the board. They built, they lured Michigan State's medical school there by building a huge new healthcare campus, and then they also did this like totally creative thing called Art Prize. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Grand Rapids Art Prize. It's gotten a lot of attention. They created this competition where they said once a year we're going to give this huge prize of $500,000 to any artist who wants to come here and like submit their art for this citywide contest. We'll bring people out for 3 weeks of the year, and people in the city and from other towns who want to come in can go vote on these projects, and whatever artist wins will win $500,000. That was actually a contest that was started by the I believe it was the DeVos family, which was the founders of Amway. So you basically had private money doing philanthropic things to create this kind of like cool competition that had a lot of money behind it, has created all kinds of tourism in the area, generated a lot of economic activity. That coupled with steering the economy more toward healthcare and other sort of little pockets of diversification have helped Grand Rapids hold up. In the meantime, they've had low cost of housing, historic downtown because of some of these, the healthcare spending there, and the art that's coming downtown. People have been moving back downtown, and they've just historically had good schools and a kind of a short commute. So I think it's not, we talk about these things like one magic bullet, and it's never one magic bullet. I think it's a broad strategy of throwing a lot of things at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Just the last thing is that hospitals and universities have been pockets of this, but it's different from the kind of thing that we're pushing. right? It's because hospital and universities, there's only so much of that. But even if you look at West Philly and how it's responded to the expansion at Penn, it's now gentrified out to 48th Street, if there's anyone who knows Philadelphia. But but we're looking for something beyond hospitals and universities. But if you go look around the country, there are a million places where around the hospital and around the university, things have really changed.
Amy, do you
Look
want to
at
add
West
anything to
Philly,
that?
too.
No, I think that's great.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there are success stories, and even in this report, I mean, I think it's important to remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people were writing on urban America writ large.
Yep.
And now we're talking about specific persistent pockets of poverty, and those are different problems, but there are success stories, and I don't think this report's a reason to despair. I think it's a reason to focus attention. You want to close it out, John, or Steve? There, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Glickman, the executive director of EIG and co-founder of it, along with John. So let me start with a few thank yous and then just a couple quick points so everyone can get out and not catch the metro. Quick thank yous. First, of course, to our panel, Janet, Amy, Kevin, Jared, and of course to our moderator, John. I want to say a little bit about what makes the panel special, but thanks for making a really fantastic, informative discussion. I also want to thank Jessica Guzik, who's standing in the back of the room. She made the event happen and deserves a big round of applause. And I want to thank all you guys for coming here. When the metro closed yesterday, we were a little bit sad. I appreciate all of the support you're providing EIG, and I'm sure it wasn't just the $5 in Uber rides, although if it was, great. We will use it again. One of the things that I think really united the panel for us and why we thought about all these individual panelists, and it's an ethos we share, and it stems off of John Avalon's hashtag Nothing Matters. It's true, and it makes me really sad. And it's temporary. Because the people on this panel are all folks who are driven by data. They're interested in data, in creating data, in evaluating data, in seeing what's actually moving the needle and how people are actually feeling. And unfortunately, it's something that the political system has overlooked or ignored for too long to its peril. And it's a part of what we're seeing here. Part of the reason we created the DCI was because I think we had an intuition that the politics was not, and politicians weren't, they weren't offering a set of solutions or even examining a set of problems that were really reflective of what people were feeling in their lives. And you hear it in this discussion, and you see it in the political debate. There's a lack of trust in Washington to be able to not only solve problems, but to even understand what they were. And so this is a way to evaluate what we think is a huge underspoken problem in America today, which is that inequality is not just individual, it's not just wages, it's not just unemployment, it's the fact that the recovery has helped a certain tranche of the country, and the recession is still being felt deeply in more and more concentrated parts of America. And who is talking to those Americans? And you see it in the populism. Those people who are voting against what you would more consider to be mainstream candidates, they feel like no one is giving them a set of solutions. And I think this analysis of risk is really interesting, that they're willing to bet on just about everyone else. Even if they're not talking about anything that's a reasonable set of policies, it's because at least they're talking to a problem that's real in America. And it starts with all of us in this room, people who are shapers of opinions and data and policy solutions, to not let the temporary political dynamics of nothing matter impact what we can do as a country to move the ball forward. And we think the real battle in this town is not between the Republicans and Democrats, although there will certainly be plenty of those battles. It's between the doers and the ideologues. And can the doers be united around a set of ideas that builds muscle memory back in this city, and so in this country, to move the needle? And we think it can. We think the conventional wisdom is wrong, although we understand why people would think that. And we think the way you baby step your way to get in the right direction is at least by evaluating the problem in a new light. And that's what this DCI is meant to do. So let me thank everyone again for coming. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, check out the website, eig.org. We spent a lot of time making all of this data very accessible and interactive. Again, a big thank you to our panelists, and we hope you'll come to more of these soon. Thank you.